So, we're back once again, and today we're going to be taking a little bit of a look at some of the ships in the game, sometimes known as World of Warships, because at this point, with the amount of weird changes and the addition of submarines coming soon, I can barely even recognize what the game I'm looking at this point. Just as incoherent as that sentence. Anyways, before I go off in a barely recognizable rant, let's get on the topic of the video. We'll be discussing 5 of my favorite ships, why I enjoy playing them, sometimes why I hate playing them, and everything in between, so let's get to it. And if you enjoy this type of content, I stream every day on twitch.tv/thedarkcalling, winning some games, losing some games, whatever. Anyways, let's get into it. So first we need to talk about the Yamato. When the Shikishima was released, I thought that it was a clone of the Yamato, to be honest, but then I realized that there was already a clone of the Yamato that you actually had to pay money for, which was the ARP Yamato, which was very well received by the community. Although, ignoring the several types of Yamato that exist, the original Yamato is still an excellent tier 10 battleship in its own right, even to this day, even though it is one of the oldest. So, a battleship that is extremely powerful and potent and can easily make an enemy Hindenburg disappear from 23 kilometers. What's not to love? Well, in the sake of balance, let's talk about some of the not so nice things you might encounter if you have just recently started playing the Yamato for the first time. Or the types of things I see new players complain about in chat when playing World of Warships. Oh, and how do I know they're new players, I hear you ask? Simple. They're usually positioned in the enemy spawn, complaining in the chat about how their team never pushes with them, and that we're all noobs, even though it's 5 minutes into the game. Anyways, from my personal experience, when I started first playing Yamato, the biggest adjustment I had to make was due to the accuracy. I simply wasn't expecting it, and so as a result, when new players are expected to adjust, especially when they're not all that familiar with the game to begin with, it tends not to go all that well, and leads to the complaints or raging you often see in the in-game chat. Although I think if you stick to a few central principles with the Yamato will play off quite well, even for the most basic of players. And that's why I love it so much. It's a basic bitch battleship. So let's get into those principles. Well, with the Yamato, and I'm sure there's other battleships that fall into this category too, the best way I've found to play the Yamato is occupying that central area of the map. Shout out to Flamu for teaching me how to play the game. This also allows you the flexibility to slap either flank in the face if the enemy team pushes too far, and provides you with that flat broadside. Another aspect is aiming. The thing about the Yamato I have found is that it's a pretty good indicator of how good your aim is. The guns are fairly consistent outside of those shots that go every direction except where you aimed, but generally if you can consistently hit decent damage numbers in the Yamato, your aim isn't completely terrible. Or it could be... what do I know? I'm barely above average. Anyways, next up is the Thunder. HE spam. So I thought I may as well feature perhaps one of the ships I have the highest amount of XP on in the game, and obviously that is the Thunder. Now the Thunder and the Yamato are very different ships, well, at least on paper. In the game, they can both make you regret pressing the battle button, although in the Thunder's case it takes a little bit of a less skill cap, shall we say, to achieve that status than it does for your average Yamato player. But what makes the Thunder good, and good enough to put on my list of good ships? Well, to be honest, it's fairly obvious. Unless you've only been playing the game for a week and haven't experienced what playing versus a Thunder is like, then let me explain. It's hell. Yeah, that's pretty much good summation. In the hands of a good Thunder player, playing versus them is the very definition of hell. And I hear the people saying, but it was nerfed not that long ago, it's not a good ship anymore. Yeah, good one. That's like saying once CVs were nerfed, they're now no longer game breaking and OP, but if we're all being honest, we just know that isn't true. So if you're new to the Thunder, my advice is relatively simple. Press the number 1 button on your keyboard and enjoy getting 150,000 useless HE damage every single game you enter. Or you could play like a traditional BB and switch when necessary between HE and AP when needed, and actually be effective in the game. But hey, who am I to tell you how to play? Oh, and one more thing. The Thunder is not a tanky ship, which is partially why I like it so much. Contrary to what people say, how you position will actually matter, so don't go all gung-ho thinking you're going to get a Kraken and soak up 3 million potential damage, when in reality the only thing you're going to be soaking up is the water as it floods into your ship as you sink to the bottom of the ocean. But enough about battleships, let's move on to some ship classes I can sign to sorta actually maybe play a little bit. So now that we're moving away from battleships, I can breathe a sigh of relief in that I don't have to pretend that I'm a good battleship player. So the next ship I'm going to be including in my list is the Siliwangi. Wait, what? Sorry, I had a little bit of a PTSD flashback from playing the Siliwangi for one game. I honestly have no idea how anyone could play that ship and come away with the impression that it's a good ship. No, the ship I want to describe was the Minotaur. I know, a little bit of a weird misstep, but we're going to go with it. Like seriously, why would I compare a destroyer of one nation to a cruiser of another? Really weird. Anyways, the Minotaur is a really fun ship. Well, it's a lot of fun to play while you're sitting in smoke farming that grows a curvers that just got the ship for the first time and is again sporting absolutely no camo or flags. But the thing most Minotaurs aren't aware of is the fact that enemy BBs, particularly those named Thunder, can see pretty accurately where your shell tracers are coming from and thus know exactly where you're positioned while you sit in that smoke. And while you're happily farming that superstructure of that GK, a bunch of 8 very angry AP shells are flying through the air to penetrate you so hard you're going to think, maybe continuing that analogy might be a bit too far. But regardless, the Minotaur can fulfill so many roles in the game, it really is one of my favourites. It can be a super destroyer and basically two-shot any actual destroyer in the game with short fuse AP, and that very same short fuse AP and rapid reload means farming enemy battleships becomes more like a fun pastime and not something you actually have to put effort into. Kind of like how playing World of Warships should be, but that's a rant for a different day. Overall, the Minotaur is a very versatile ship, and so many ways to play it, whether you take radar or smoke, but just don't be surprised if you decide to start grinding for it and you end up dying early a hell of a lot, because again, British light cruisers tend to go up like the 4th of July if touched inappropriately. Let's switch classes again and move on to a class that I can actually play, destroyers. So we're going to be looking at 2 different destroyers on this section of the video, the first one being the Daring. There isn't all that much to say about the Daring except for the fact that daring to play it for the first time might leave you a little bit confused, especially when it comes to short duration smokes. The uniqueness of the Daring is a bit of an odd one for any budding DD main. It occupies a... well, honestly, I don't know how to describe the Daring. It is a very unique destroyer in and of itself. I mean, it sits a little bit between every destroyer role. It can 1v1 if called upon, but there are destroyers that it loses to. It can gunboat, but it's not going to take half HP of a battleship in the duration of each of its smokes. And it's not a torpedo, although again, the torpedoes can be very potent if used in the right situations. So I'd probably put the Daring as the middle child of the DDs in the game. The type of middle child that's pretty smart, pretty athletic, but still gets no attention from the parents because they're just not quite the best. Well, that was a weird analogy. Definitely not projecting. If you're thinking about playing the Daring for the first time, there's some things you should know. Firstly, when you play a DD, stop rushing into the caps. Please, please, please. Too many lives are being lost to people rushing into caps, so please stop. But with that being said, you can still strongly contest caps on the Daring. You just need to be aware of things like enemy radars and enemy DDs in the game. So if you only see Shimakazes on the enemy DDs, you can probably take caps with a bit of hydro. The same probably couldn't be said if you see an Alaska and 2 Kitakazes on the enemy team. So, if you are cautiously aggressive, know how to use your smokes effectively, and can take calculated risks, you'll do well. And probably won't even need to watch this video. Anyways, let's move on to the final ship. I've featured quite a bit on my channel since grinding it. So at long last we reached the Halland, or as I like to call it, the fast torpedo ship, both in terms of the speed of its torpedoes and the reload time of them. The Halland is probably the best, or at least one of the best torpedo ships in the game, even when compared to the likes of the Shimakaze. But of course, like all good things, it's easy to focus solely on the main aspect of the Halland and forget the fact that it still has some pretty decent guns, although almost anything compared to the silly Wangi has decent guns. Why is that ship stuck? What? Anyways, let's move on to what makes the Halland my favourite ship in the game. For one thing, the main issue that you're going to have when playing any destroyer in World of Warships is generally going to be carriers. But not in the Halland. Well, at least not until there are double carriers in the game and they decide to focus you. Yeah, that might be tough, but overall the Halland is a ship ideally suited to absolutely eviscerate plane squadrons in a matter of seconds. And it's a characteristic no other DD really has, and aside from the fact that making CV players exit the game, open up the forums and post threads about how carriers should be buffed, the Halland is capable of being used in pretty much every mood. You want to zone out in autopilot for a bit? Sure thing, Alt tab, then tab back in, launch a few torpedoes, and tab back out. Or do you want to have a little bit more fun and engage with enemy DDs? Sure thing, you still have relatively decent guns to do that also. So overall, the Halland is a good fun ship. And depending on my mood, honestly, any one of these ships could be my favourite depending on the day, but that wouldn't make much sense in a video like this. So, that's pretty much it for another video. Let me know your favourite ships are in World of Warships. But with that being said, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next one.